Hello everyone and welcome to the University of Gloucestershire's Living Room Lecture Series. I've interpreted living room a little bit liberally. I'm actually sitting in my dining room area at the moment because I've got a lovely view out of the window looking at the birds in my garden as I talk to you, and you've got a little bit of a view of the garden behind me as well. I'm going to wait for a minute or so just while people are joining us after the notification has gone out. But while I'm doing that, I thought I'd say a little bit about why it is that I'm talking to you today. I'm one of the ecologists at the University of Gloucestershire. I'm active in both teaching and research, but I've been fascinated by wildlife right from a really young age. Birds are my first love, and I think that probably comes from being taken to feed the ducks by my mum and my dad as a child, and I was always fascinated in doing that, but I always wanted to know why some of the birds were behaving in different ways, why some of them were upending like mallards and others, diving ducks, were diving down for food. And I was always asking questions about the natural environment. And I think the other thing that really spurred my interest is that I got into photography, and particularly photography of the natural environment, because it's all around us. It's a brilliant subject to take photos of. So when you're doing that, you have to be observing what's going on around you. You have to be patient and prepared to wait. And you have to really be getting a little bit of an understanding about what it is that you're shooting. So from feeding the ducks and a budding interest in photography when I was a child, I've become more and more interested in the natural world. As I say, birds are my first love, but basically anything that grows, runs, hops, jumps, flaps, chirrups or cheeps is something that fascinates me. Okay, I can see we've got people joining us, so I'm going to make a start. If there are questions, please do pop those questions into the comments field as I'm talking things through, and I'll come back to those questions at the end. Equally, if people have got other top tips about watching winter wildlife, do feel free to post those into the comments window as well. I think we're very fortunate in the UK to live in a seasonal environment. And that means that when we go out, even to locations and habitats and environments that we know really well, we tend to find that things change over the course of the year. And that can be brilliant at really keeping an interest nice and fresh, even if you are going to the same places throughout the year. Now, obviously, spring is a brilliant time. You've got leaves coming in to burst, you've got bulbs starting to grow, flowers starting to bloom, birds starting to breed, and species like hedgehogs coming back out of hibernation. Summer is fantastic. We've got long days, we've got hopefully nice warm days that are filled with things like butterflies and bumblebees and other pollinators, and evenings where you can be observing things like bats coming out and foraging. Obviously, autumn is fantastic as well. Brightly coloured trees, lovely leaves changing colour as we go through the autumn months, but still some nice warm days to get out and enjoy wildlife and still see things like flying insects and so on. And then we have winter. And I think winter gets a really bad press because as much as it can be lovely to think about nice snowy days, the majority of winter in the UK tends to be fairly cold and fairly damp. And it can feel a little bit restricted in what you can see in terms of wildlife. But actually, winter is an absolutely amazing time to get out into the natural world and to try and find different species. And I think if 2020 has told us anything, it's that we really need to get out and engage with nature. We do have nature all around us, and with many of us much less able to travel than in previous years. I think certainly for me, it's really brought home how lucky we are in the UK to have wildlife around us that we can see in our local area. And I think it's very true that the more you look for, the more you find. So what should you be looking for, and where should you be going to look for that? Well, let's have a start with plants. Plants are the sort of powerhouse of the natural world. Winter is a great time for looking at trees. When we look at trees in spring, summer and autumn, we tend to sort of see the overall outline of the tree, but a lot of the sort of architecture of the tree itself is dominated by the leaves and hidden from us. In winter, we really get to see the structure of trees, and in a lot of cases, surprising colour as well, particularly in species such as willow, where new growth can be a lovely red or yellow colour. It's also great for having access to trunks of trees, and that might be from a wildlife perspective, looking at things like bracket fungi. So bracket fungi are amazing growths that come out from the trunks of trees, particularly species such as ash and beech, and do form literally like brackets as though you were putting up shelving. And you can find a whole range of different bracket fungi in the UK, and some really big ones as well. Being able to see more of the tree structure also means that we can see more of the species that live in or on trees as well. Particularly coming up to Christmas, we might be thinking about mistletoe. And mistletoe is what we refer to as a hemiparasite. So it takes some nutrients from the tree itself, but it also has its own green leaves and photosynthesizes, so it makes its own energy. It's a really interesting sort of halfway house in terms of ecological strategy, halfway from between being a parasite and not, if you like. Within Gloucestershire, we're also right at the heart of the range of a really restricted species called the mistletoe marble moth. And that's a species where the larvae, the caterpillars, depend on mistletoe in order to survive. And there's only a very small area within the UK that mistletoe marble moths live. And Gloucestershire and Herefordshire and Worcestershire are really the centre of that restricted distribution. So if you're out and about and you see large areas of mistletoe, obviously please don't remove those. They can look really pretty, I know, in people's homes, but fundamentally they need to be out in the natural world. And they are really important for species like mistletoe marble moth, which you might not be seeing, but will be in a lot of cases within those mistletoe bundles. You might also be able to start seeing bird nests, and that might be nests that are there from previous years, or even new nests. I found my first nest of the 2021 season last week, which was a pigeon nest. Pigeons tend to nest quite early, but also herons. Herons will, surprisingly to many people, nest up in trees, and you can get quite large heroneries, and they tend to start nesting quite early, usually around January, February kind of time. And around Upton upon Severn is a really good place to go and have a little look for heroneries. You might also see sort of odd patches of twigs growing out from trees, particularly in silver birch. And you might originally think that those are bird nests, but they don't quite look like bird nests. And that can often be something called witch's broom, which is actually an immune response from the tree, where you end up with lots of new growth going off in all different directions, twiggy growth. So if you see something that looks like a nest at first glance, but when you look at it in more detail, it's not, that might well be witch's broom, which is a really cool name as well as a cool phenomenon. I think when you're out and about in winter, try and challenge yourself to identify trees and shrubs, even without their leaves. And if you're looking for inspiration on how to do this, just pop into an internet search engine, winter twigs or identification of winter twigs. The Wildlife Trust has done a really good online resource for how to identify things. Moving from plants to fungi. I guess autumn is the traditional time to see fungi, but winter can be really good as well. We've had lots of honey fungus around this year, which is clustered yellow to mid-brown small mushrooms that are often grouped around the base of trees. And they tend to be quite flat-topped as they age as well. Perhaps more suitably for the season, though, is fly agaric. If you imagine sort of the archetypal toadstool that you'll have seen in cartoons as a child, a red colour with yellow flecks on it, that's fly agaric. And it's associated with Christmas cards and Christmas wreaths throughout Central and Eastern Europe, and also up in Scandinavia as well, where it's associated a lot with midwinter festivals, with people coming into yurts and so on, with bags of fly agaric mushrooms. That's definitely under the heading of don't try this at home. In terms of insects, winter can definitely be a challenging time to be looking for insects, but there are some around if you look for them. In terms of moths, we do have some moth species that will be on the wing throughout winter. Aptly named winter moth is a species that is triangular or inverted heart-shaped and tends to be a pale grey or pale brown colour with central stripes that go across both wings. We also have a species called the satellite moth, which occurs right the way through the winter period. And that's sort of a kind of a rusty reddish brown colour, and it has two obvious white spots on the wings. And then next to each of those really obvious white spots, there are smaller, really faint white spots around those bigger ones, and those are the satellites from which the satellite moth gets its name. So in exactly the same way as you might have satellites circling Saturn or Jupiter, that's exactly the pattern on the back of the satellite moth. We also have the December moth, and the peak flight time for that moth, as the name suggests, is December, but particularly around Christmas week. And that's a really, really striking moth. It tends to have quite an upright pose. So whereas we tend to think of moths generally as being fairly 2D in that direction, a December moth tends to perch almost in that direction on a different plane from normal. And really attractively marked moth. It's a sort of, again, a reddish brown colour with a light coloured face and really, really fluffy antennae. You might also be seeing butterflies around. Obviously, summer is our peak period for butterflies, but some species will overwinter as adults, and particularly things such as red admiral and small tortoiseshell can be around. I've got a hibernating small tortoiseshell in my downstairs cloakroom at the moment. Ladybirds will often hibernate as well, and you can quite often, if you find evergreen species, so species such as Scots pine, for example, with low branches, have a little look into those and you'll often see that you've got ladybirds within that hibernating. Some of those might be non-native species, so harlequin ladybird, which tends to be very, very variably marked, but quite a big round ladybird. But also it's been a great year for seven-spot ladybirds. And I was out walking on Bredon Hill, just on the border between Gloucestershire and Worcestershire last weekend, and came across a tree that had lots and lots of hibernating seven-spot ladybirds in it. So have a look, you never know what you might find. You might also still find bees on the wing, bumblebees in particular, if it's a nice warm day. And if you want a specialist winter invertebrate species, then have a little look for rugged oil beetles. It's a really rare species, but a species that has been found at several places within Gloucestershire, particularly around Stroud and the Slad valleys, and on the Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust Reserve up at Swifts Hill in particular. Moving on to mammals, obviously many mammals are hibernating at the moment, but it's a great time of year to start seeing deer because there's greater visibility in woodlands. It's much easier to spot them. And one of the banes of walks at the moment is mud. but do have a look at the mud itself, because quite often you can see footprints in the mud and you can start becoming a little bit of a mammal detective by looking at indirect evidence, particularly looking at things such as deer, which tend to leave slots within the mud, but also things such as foxes, for example, and smaller wildlife as well. If you are out and about, then do have a look. There's a wildlife trust guide that's online to footprints, or if you want something to take out and about with you, the Field Study Council do as a cheap fold-out guide that's really good at getting you to know a lot of those different footprints. If you are out and about and you are taking photos of footprints to identify when you get home, top tip is to put something in that footprint for scale. I was out on a walk recently in Gloucestershire and found some footprints. I wasn't 100% sure what they were, but I thought they might be mink. And I didn't have anything with me, like a ruler or anything for scale. So I just put part of my headphones that I had with me, my earbuds with me, and just popped that down next to the footprints to take a photo. So I had something for scale when I got home. And indeed, they were mink footprints, another non-native species in the UK. Grey squirrels are also around and about, and they are, again, easy to see at this sort of time and might be particularly busy hiding or burying nuts and acorns to see them through the colder months. If you're further afield, you might possibly be seeing, oddly, offspring being born at this kind of year. Grey squirrels will have their pups October, November in Wales off the coast of Pembrokeshire, and November, December off the English coast, and particularly around Clyde next to the sea, Donanook and Blakeney Point are really good places to go and see grey squirrel pups at this time of year. Not exactly Gloucestershire, but if your travels over Christmas take you further afield, then that might be something to look out for. And I'll sort of end the talk aspect of this by thinking about my first love, which is birds. And we tend to think of migrant species when we think of migrant birds as being things like swallow and house martin that come and visit us in the winter. But actually, that come and visit us in the summer, I should say. But actually, we also have a lot of migrant birds that come and visit us in the winter instead. Winter thrushes are about at the moment and in really, really good numbers. We've got both redwing and fieldfare around at the moment. Obviously, doing this kind of talk is quite difficult because I'd normally be bringing up lots of different photos to show you, and I can't do that. But what I can do is to use some of my ornaments. This is a song thrush, and a redwing or a fieldfare will look quite similar to this. In the case of redwing, very similar, but with red under the armpit of the wing. Fieldfare, a bit like a cross between a thrush and a female blackbird, but with quite striking grey markings on it as well. They can be seen all over the place at the moment, but particularly along hedgerows that have got a nice knot of berries, especially hawthorn berries. If you're looking for a good place in Gloucestershire to go and see those kind of species, Coombe Hill Nature Reserve between Gloucester and Tewkesbury, just off the main A38, is brilliant. I went up there last week and must have seen genuinely well over 1,000 fieldfare and redwing in the course of a walk up there. Some years we also get waxwings in the UK, which are probably the most striking, or one of the most striking birds that we have in the UK. And again, they will be after berries. Waxwings, fieldfares and redwings are all examples of eruptive migrants. So they typically live in Scandinavia, but when the weather gets cold up there, they'll come down a little bit further south and into the UK, seeking berries in order to sustain them through the winter. And as I say, it's been a particularly good year this year for winter thrushes. I haven't seen any waxwings yet, but one of the great things about those, they'll often be going for trees such as rowan, which are frequently planted even in places such as industrial estates or supermarket car parks. So you can literally see them anywhere. It's not just about eruptive migrants though. We also have some partial migrants in the bird world, where we have resident species, resident individuals in the UK, but they're joined by a lot more individuals that come south for the winter. And two classic examples there are probably the bird that is most associated with Christmas, which is the robin, with its nice red breast. Robins are a brilliant species to see at this time of year because we have them all year round, but the numbers are swelled considerably over winter by robins coming down from Scandinavia and across from mainland Europe as well to take advantage of our more temperate conditions. And they're also a species that will be in song all year round. We normally think of bird song as being a spring phenomenon, but actually robins will be defending their territories throughout the year, so they'll be singing right the way through. And again, unusually in birds, female robins will be singing as well as males. Starlings are another species where we get a lot more individuals coming to join us over winter, and you often find over winter is murmuration season. So if you fancy going and witnessing one of the most amazing natural spectacles in the world, try and head out to try and watch a starling murmuration. They can occur pretty much anywhere. I saw a very small murmuration, probably 1,000 birds or so, just in the lee of Breeden Hill yesterday evening. To sort of see more spectacular murmurations, slightly outside of county, but either going to RSPB Otmore over near Oxford or down to Ham Wall or Shapwick Heath on the Somerset levels are great areas to witness starling murmurations. And they occur just before dusk. So you want to be getting there around about half an hour before sunset and make sure you've got a torch with you to get back to your car afterwards. We also have other species that roost communally. Pied wagtails are a really good example, and these are species that will often come together in city centres and be using city centre trees in order to roost in the winter months. And that quite often happens in Cheltenham, particularly the trees that are on the edge of Marks and Spencer's, just down the side road there where a lot of the buses stop, and also the trees in the promenade area near Waterstone's bookshop. So if you're out and about there, sunset or early dusk, keep an eye out in the trees just in case you get lucky seeing a whole load of pied wagtails coming together to spend the night in a nice warm roost. We also have migrating water birds, so things like Buick Swans and Hooper Swans, smaller than our normal mute swans and with a yellow and black bill rather than orange and black bill. You need to be sort of checking what's feasible in terms of COVID restrictions and where people are opening wildlife reserves and so on. But WWT Slimbridge is a great place to go and watch swan feeds, particularly around about 4 o'clock. They usually do one that you can see from the hide, assuming that that's open. Check before you travel on that one. And then finally, you might be seeing species that are quite common, but quite difficult to see in winter. So species such as the lovely nuthatch, which occurs, try and get that so that it's easily visible, occurs on trees. It will be going down the tree to search for invertebrates. They're around all year, but they're tricky to see. Keep a lookout in the winter. And the same goes for species such as great spotted woodpeckers. So they will be around on trees. This is an example of a bracket fungus that I mentioned earlier on. And great spotted woodpeckers, really easy to start to see at this time of year because it's so much easier to visualise them. And they've got a really strident call, and around January and February, they will also be starting to drum on trees as well. So if you hear the sort of noise, almost like a mini power drill, that's the sort of noise of a great spotted woodpecker, and that will be picking up January, February time. And the absolute final one to keep an eye out for are owls. Winter is a great time to see owls because they're around sort of more at the time that we're around, because obviously the days are shorter. You might be seeing these as you're moving around the county at dusk. And certainly when it comes to species such as little owl, they start breeding really early. So they tend to be in voice, again, January, February time. And the sort of sound that you're hearing for those is like that. So if you hear something that sounds quite surprised rather than a general to-woo of an owl, something that sounds a little bit more strident, a little bit more alarmed or surprised, it may well be a little owl. That brings me to the end of what I wanted to say about winter wildlife. I hope it's inspired you to get out and start looking for species and thinking about where you might want to go. I mentioned quite a few different places to head out to as I was going through that. Obviously, plenty of places to go to. I've mentioned Coombe Hill and Swifts Hill GWT reserves. RSPB Nag's Head over in the Forest of Dean is a great place to go to for woodland species, as are the areas around Cranham, the beech woods up around Cranham. Crickley Hill is great just for general wildlife walks with amazing views as well. Pittville Park is fantastic for water birds. There are mandarin ducks there at the moment and also kingfishers, both really attractive bird species. And when the weather starts getting a little bit warmer, heading out to somewhere like the Rococo Garden over in Painswick is great for snowdrops as they start emerging in January and February. Slightly outside of county, I mentioned Otmoor and Ham Wall, but also if you're interested in looking at deer, Chalcott Park up near Stratford-upon-Avon is fantastic as well. But think about your own garden. Put out a bird feeder, look at what's around right where you are, and really try and challenge yourself to find wildlife and appreciate wildlife, especially over the Christmas period. So that brings me to the end of what I wanted to say, but very happy to now go to the questions, and I see there's quite a few of those coming in. So I'll go through those. Feel free to keep on popping questions into the chat window, and also any other top tips or places to go as well. So I've got a question in here about how overwintering invertebrates survive, obviously with short days, cold weather, and in a lot of cases, not a huge amount of nectar around as well. In a lot of cases, invertebrates will be effectively hibernating, overwintering or hibernating. So they will be slowing their metabolic processes down, exactly in the same way that a bat or a hedgehog would hibernate. A lot of invertebrates will also be doing that. So I mentioned ladybirds and butterflies, which often overwinter as adults. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're making sure that they're slowing their processes down, going somewhere that is quite sheltered, and living out the winter in a dormant state. In terms of frogs, frogs will be slowing down their ecology as they're going through the winter periods to cope with colder temperatures. They don't hibernate particularly in an ecological sense, but it very much is slowing things down. I think the main thing is if you have got something like a garden pond, then making sure that your garden pond has got some deep sections in it. So if you get ice that occurs on the top of the pond, there'll be liquid water underneath the ice is great. If you've got a pond that you know is really, really shallow, then if you do get really cold weather and the pond is completely frozen over the top, just making sure that you break the edge of that so that there is some egress from that overall pond area can be great to help frogs. A couple of bird-related questions. We are starting to get quite a few birds that we typically think of as summer migrants that are sticking with us over the winter. So chiffchaffs are a really good example and a great bird because they basically call their own name, and literally the call is chiff-chaff, 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 chiff. And we are starting to get individuals that are overwintering with us. Seven Hams area around Coombe Hill or Asherworth Ham are great places to see those. Cotswold Water Park, there are a lot as well. I think the count there a couple of weekends ago were over sort of 30 individual chiff-chaffs at that location. A few other species doing it as well, little egrets, in some cases willow warblers are around as well. And long-tailed tits, again, a classic species, around all year, but they tend to be easier to spot in the winter time because of the fact that you've got fewer leaves getting in the way of your bird viewing. Oh, a top tip here about waxwings. So a waxling sighting from Ashley, just north of Hereford last week. So do keep an eye out, and looking at things like Twitter is a great way of starting to understand where key birds are being spotted. And also, if you are in Gloucestershire, look at the Gloucester Birder website as well. It's a great way of starting to see where people are recording more unusual or charismatic species, and you can head out and have a look at those. So another comment in about woodpeckers starting to become vocal already, and say great spotted woodpeckers giving a strident call or drumming. Green woodpeckers, their country name is yaffle, and you'll often hear them almost like quite a hysterical laugh. If you start hearing that kind of noise, that's a green woodpecker. So great to hear that they're around. And I'm not quite sure that I'm believing my eyes at the moment, because I'm looking at the screen, and just over the top of that, in my garden, in the hawthorn bush, I've got a great spotted woodpecker that's come in. And there's no sensible way of me turning the laptop round for you to see that. So I will re-show my ornament to show you in real time what I'm looking at outside of the window. And that's a great example of just keep looking. I've not seen a great spotted woodpecker in my garden for several weeks, and as if by magic, as I'm talking about it, I've got one appearing. When they fly, they've also got a really undulating flight as they sort of dip up and down. So if you see that, that's absolutely classic. And sparrowhawks being seen in Churchdown, amazing birds to see so close. Absolutely. Yeah, they're fantastic. And again, they'll be a species that was often coming into gardens more in the winter time in order to take advantage of the fact that there tend to be more small birds, including sparrows, in gardens over winter as well. Okay, really good to get all of your wildlife sightings and some questions in the mix as well. So if there's no other questions, I'll end by saying thank you very much. It's great to have been able to share some of my interest in wildlife with you this lunchtime. I hope it's inspired you to get outside, and really good to see quite a lot of familiar names in the chat window as well, including a couple of former and current students in the mix as well. So that's great. Thank you very much indeed, everyone. Happy wildlife watching.